BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. BlackBoxNid88 on Instagram for the bonus podcast. And welcome to BBOR, the home of true crime talk radio and your premier destination for unsolved mysteries, criminal psychology, and exploring the dark side of cyberspace. My name is Ned DeHaan, and I am your host, as well as the creator of Astro Psych 400 here on YouTube, and regular contributor to the Zodiac Killer channel. And a great way to support these shows is just by listening to some more content. But you can also go over to Amazon.com and have a look at the book Killer on a White Horse, written by me, Ned DeHaan. It is a novel, murder mystery, inspired by the Zodiac Manson connection, but it is indeed fictional. However, who doesn't love a good mystery? And there is always the TeeSpring page. Feel free to check out some of the merchandise. And remember, being weird is not a crime. Let the show begin. Okay, hello everybody. Today is Monday, another Zodiac Monday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? I hope everyone had a good weekend. First, I would like to say thank you to all of you guys who listened to the most recent interview that I did on last week's Zodiac Monday with Jeremy Berthiaume, who is the author of So I See You Don't Paint Houses, a book about the Zodiac Killer mystery, and it explores the possibility of Richard Gaikowski being the Zodiac Killer. But if you read the book or if you listen to my interview with Jeremy, you'll see very early on that he's open to talking about other Zodiac suspects. And before I go any further, I would like to remind you guys that you can hit the like button and subscribe to this channel. Those are some great ways to help out Black Box Online Radio. And you can also go through some of the links in the description box, including one for BuyMeACoffee.com, BuyMeACoffee.com/BlackBoxNid88, and that allows you to make a donation or contribution to help support the show, and anybody who makes a donation will get a shout-out on Zodiac Monday. And before we get into some of the Zodiac-related topics, I just have one final update, and that is that recently on the channel, I was talking to you guys about how one of the videos on Black Box Online Radio was removed. It was actually an old podcast-like recording, an old Black Box recording from 2020, where I was talking about Jeffrey Epstein and some of the secrets of the global elites. And that video was taken down by the YouTube censors, and I tried to appeal the strike. Well, I didn't get a channel strike. I tried to appeal them taking down the video, and it isn't so much because I wanted the video back online. It was simply because the reasons why they chose to take it down, they accused this channel of possible bullying, possible harassment, and overly sexual content, putting out overly sexual content, and I absolutely disagreed with that, and I didn't want those labels associated with anything to do with Black Box Online Radio. I want to be as far away from those types of labels as possible, and I was more or less just flabbergasted, for lack of a better term, that they would accuse me of doing something like that when I'm just talking about a documentary that I watched about Jeffrey Epstein that was made available on Netflix. And the specific parts that were highlighted were when I was talking about how in the past, there are lots of conspiracy theories about how there are sex rings connected to the global elites. However, after the Jeffrey Epstein story and Ghislaine Maxwell and Epstein's suicide, it became public knowledge, and that was an example of one story that wasn't just a wild conspiracy theory. Jeffrey Epstein had real connections to the global elites, and he was more or less running Lolita Island, Little St. James and the U.S. Virgin Islands, for lack of a better term, and it was frequented by many global elites, particularly Prince Andrew. And, this stuff is all public knowledge, and the fact that just talking about it on Black Box Online Radio got the video taken down. And I have to give a shout out to YouTube user Derek Green, who said, "They want it gone. Who do you think owns YouTube? And it's not the only island. Know what I mean?" Yeah, absolutely. I know what you mean. It almost just that's the only explanation that I can think of, that the YouTube overlords just simply don't want that type of content out there, and they just want to suppress everything in the far-off corners of YouTube first, and then the mainstream stories will die out later on. But I am very disappointed with the way that YouTube is handling its content. But in this episode, though, I do have a lot of Zodiac Killer material to talk to you guys about. And firstly, I want to respond to some of the comments that you guys left on the most recent interview that I did with Jeremy Bertiom, and not only talking about Richard Gaikowski, but about all things Zodiac related. And Jeremy believes that the first Zodiac murder took place in 1965 with the murder of Thomas Snow, and I will be discussing that one later on. The first comment comes to us from Restless Dreams, who says, "So basically, the only Zodiac killer connection with Richard Gaikowski is good times and a possible friendship with Darlene Ferrin, so weak." Now, Richard Gaikowski did work for a newspaper called The Good Times, and in a letter, the Zodiac Killer did say that he was having good times in Vallejo. So some people immediately think that that's a connection, other people think that it's just a linguistic coincidence. Now, Darlene Ferrin was the second victim of the Zodiac Killer, who was murdered at the Blue Rock Spring shooting on July 4th of 1969, although it's possible that maybe the shooting occurred at 12:01 a.m. on July 5th of 1969. It's not like anyone was there with a calendar updating things immediately as they happened, so it requires a certain amount of estimation. But a lot of people have explored the possibility of a friendship existing between Richard Gaikowski and one of the Zodiac victims. And I mean, most notably because Darlene Ferrin lived in Albany, and then Richard Gaikowski lived in Albany, and then they both ended up back on the West Coast. And another thing that added an element of clarity to the Zodiac mystery was Jeremy, author of So I See You Don't Paint Houses, talked about how his theory was that two of the Zodiac killer victims were targeted, and two attacks were committed in a random way, possibly to create this series of unrelated murders to confuse the authorities, when in reality there were two specific targets, or two people were murdered for specific reasons. And I'll talk a little bit more about that with the murder of Thomas Snow later on, but I think that that provides some clarity because some people think that Richard Gaikowski also knew Paul Stine. Paul Stine was the final victim of the Zodiac Killer, and there's the very famous story that Richard Gaikowski possibly attended his funeral and he was recognized there, even though they didn't. I mean, when I say recognized, they identified him later on, but they just didn't know who this guy was who attended Paul Stine's funeral. And it's also alleged that Richard Gaikowski ran a switchboard on the street where Paul Stine lived, so Gaikowski is more or less doing work on the street where Paul Stine lived, multiple possible connections to another Zodiac Killer victim. So you see, the Lake Herman Road murders and the Lake Berryessa stabbing. The Lake Herman Road murders took place on December 20th of 1968 with the murders of David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen, and the Lake Berryessa stabbing took place on September 27th of 1969 with the murder of Cecilia Shepard, and Brian Hartnell survived that. And those were the crimes that Jeremy more or less said were random attacks, and that because Richard Gaikowski had connections to Darlene Ferrin and Paul Stine, they were targeted victims. Now, here is something that I think has to be added to that sequence of events. It would go into a theory that has also been discussed by Tom Voigt of ZodiacKiller.com, and that is that Richard Gaikowski would have been a real serial killer. In that theory, he was never convicted of these crimes, and Gaik passed away in 2004, but he would have had to have been a real serial killer, and a prolific serial killer, actually, who would have committed numerous murders around California in the late 1960s and possible early 1970s, and the Zodiac persona was only attributed to a certain set of crimes, a certain set of homicides. And I do think that there is a certain amount of clarity that Jeremy has brought to this theory involving Richard Gaikowski, but I think that I'm going to have to look at another comment here and I'll share something with you. It comes to us from Death by Stereo, who says 35 minutes in and it's just another theory with zero sources or evidence. Okay, this is where people get critical of these theories involving Richard Gaikowski as a Zodiac Killer suspect. They point to the fact that it's circumstantial. And when I was watching the documentary on the Bad Things True Crime channel, they flat out said that. The case against Gaikowski is all circumstantial. It's all circumstantial evidence. Where is the hard evidence? And you have to extend that beyond a single suspect. Where is the hard evidence for anything in the Zodiac Killer case? I think that most people agree that they do not have the Zodiac killer's DNA, that maybe a DNA sample was indeed extracted from the stamp on one of the envelopes, and the DNA is actually on the stamp itself, as I understand it, but that's from the outside of the stamp, not the underside, and it was touch DNA. Therefore, that could have come from numerous other people, and it's quite possible that the Zodiac killer didn't even lick the stamps and envelopes himself because he he just chose not to. He might have sealed them with water. I mean, which isn't unheard of. I mean, I told you I have family members who do that, and some people just simply do not like the taste of glue, like Zodiac suspect Arthur Lee Allen, or other people just do it because it's fashionable, as Mike Rodelli points out in his book, and in an episode that he authored for Black Box Online Radio called "Do They Have the Zodiac Killer's DNA?" That it's quite possible that the Zodiac sealed the envelopes with a small sponge and water, which would have been a fashionable thing to do, and Mike Rodelli has some other examples of how the Zodiac wrote on monarch-sized stationery, which would have been something else. It would have been high-end and fashionable, and he has a suspect who was more or less in the elite circles, named Shel Cavalli. So there are all of these points that can be connected to other suspects, but also, most notably, it is almost certain that they don't have the Zodiac killer's DNA, or at the very least, they have not yet completed a profile of someone who could truly be the Zodiac killer. It seems like they did extract DNA to the point where they could have made a profile, or they did make a profile of someone, but that person could not have possibly been the Zodiac killer, and Tom Voigt released a statement about that recently. So I'm voting no, they don't have the Zodiac killer's DNA, and there's also been a new report that they might not even have the Zodiac killer's fingerprints, and the fingerprints might have belonged to a witness named Lindsay Robbins, who confessed to touching the cab, although it's somewhat of a second-hand confession. He told his son, who then went public with it recently, or at least it was made recent knowledge to the general public, so there is not a lot of physical evidence, and how are we ever going to get answers? I mean, we ought to be relying on things like deathbed confessions, or maybe if someone finds the Lake Berryessa costume, or if somebody finds Paul Stine's wallet. This case is solvable. However, I mean, the forensic evidence that is mostly used, particularly genealogical DNA, is going to be more difficult to obtain. We have a comment that is coming to us from Tony Smith, who says, "I think all of the Zodiac murders were attacks on strangers." Now, it's possible. It's possible. I mean, Jeremy has his own theory, and it appears that Tony Smith has his own theory in a different direction. And, I mean, even if there is some type of connection with Richard Gaikowski to Darlene Ferrin, that doesn't mean that he killed her. Oh, and this is what a lot of people look at with the Zodiac Killer case. What they think of is that the locations were important, not the victims. That possibly the Zodiac Killer had some type of mathematical connection to the locations and not the victims. Gareth Penn talked all about this in his book Time 17, and even last year on the channel I was talking to an individual who uses the name Sphere the Cube, also known as Sphery, and he had this whole theory about how, I mean, it's not even a crazy theory. It's just like using the words on the Zodiac Killer's letters, who is talking about radians and inches along the radians, and that there are mathematical reasons why the locations were chosen, and there is just a set of mathematical signatures that have been shared, and that doesn't even mean or require that the victims were specifically targeted. That could very easily be explained by the fact that the locations were chosen and the victims were strangers. And some people have trouble following these discussions on Black Box Online Radio because at first I'm saying one thing that's kind of praiseworthy about Jeremy's theory, and now I'm saying something praiseworthy about Tony's theory, but that's the whole point. Weighing the merit of the idea, looking at how sometimes people have good points, sometimes people have bad points, and in an unsolved case there are multiple possibilities that can be presented, and I do appreciate the skepticism of somebody like Tony who's simply going to point out that this is an unsolved mystery and the Zodiac Killer has not been identified. Therefore, how is it fair for any of us to say that there are true connections between the Zodiac and one of the victims, or the Zodiac and among all of the victims? So it really is quite possible that the Zodiac Killer targeted strangers. The next question comes to us from Carl Karras, who says, "Thanks, good discussion, but was Gaikowski writing the cryptograms?" I think that it is mostly universally accepted that the Zodiac Killer wrote the 408 cipher and the 340 cipher. I mean, all of it seems to link together. All of it seems to have a type of unifying connection. There's the same type of esoteric language in the solutions. There's the same discussion on slaves and paradise and death and being reborn in the afterlife, and those whom I have killed will be my slaves. All of that seems to be present there. And as far as the Z13 and the Z32, I have no reason to think that the Zodiac Killer did not write those, and I believe that they are confirmed ciphers for a reason. Now, you'll find alternative theories out there, such as the one put forward by Thomas Henry Horan, who stated that he believes that the Zodiac Killer, he believes that the Zodiac wrote the first three letters, that it's the Zodiac hoax theory that his suspect, Hal Snook, wrote at least the first three letters, and that somebody else did the penmanship on the ciphers because the handwriting is different. But again, he doesn't have a single suspect for everything because he believes there was a letter writer, a cryptogram writer, and there were different murderers at each of the crime scenes. And our next comment comes to us from Stephen Walker, who says, 3 hours and 42 minutes for an interview. I'm saving this for my insomnia overnight listening. And sure, I invite people to use Black Box Online Radio if they want to fall asleep at night. A lot of people say that they use this show as a way to fall asleep, and I do too. I mean, because this is one of the podcasts that is out there without bumper music or any type of loud sound effects in the middle. Well, some of the older episodes have that, but I stopped using them. And I still invite all of you guys to visit the channel AstroPsych400 here on YouTube. That is another YouTube channel that I worked with for a while, and I created something called the Podcast for Sleep because a lot of people were saying that they use BBOR to fall asleep at night, so I thought, why not create a podcast that is specifically designed to help people fall asleep and just talking about some lighter subjects other than true crime. But if you choose to use BBOR for that, more power to you. I definitely welcome it. And I said that in Jeremy's Zodiac Killer theory that he believes that the first Zodiac murder took place in 1965 with the murder of Thomas Snow, and I would like to talk to you guys about that for a while. Now, he also explores the Darlene Ferrer and Richard Gaikowski friendship a little bit more, thinking that this might have been something that Darlene Ferrin actually witnessed. But firstly, let's look at who was Thomas Snow, and I'm going to go to an article from the Oakland Tribune that was put out on Friday, September 24th of 1965, just citing the source, and it says, Bay Area restaurant owner killed. Tom Snow was found shot. And this was in Pleasant Hill. Tom Snow, age 54, was the co-owner of the fashionable Casa Orinda restaurant at Orinda Crossroads, and he was shot to death early Tuesday on a lonely stretch of highway. Sheriff's officers are working on the theory that he was murdered. Sheriff's Detective Joe Walsh said Snow was found by two highway patrolmen lying on his back beside his station wagon on Taylor Boulevard, 500 yards north of Pleasantville Road at 2:28 a.m. Snow died at Contra Costa Hospital in Martinez, California at 3:03 a.m., 4 minutes after he was admitted. There were head wounds. Walsh and Snow had two bullet wounds. Walsh said that Snow had two bullet wounds in his head. Again, to be clear, only Thomas Snow was shot. A .38 caliber revolver was found in the crook of the victim's left arm. One slug pierced Snow's hat, which was still on, and creased the scalp, and the other bullet entered his head behind his left ear. Snow is right-handed. So yeah, the bullet is shot by his left ear. I think that goes to show that almost certainly he was murdered, and I think that the tone of this article is truly exploring the possibility of a suicide. This guy is found shot in the side of the head on the side of the road. Now, did he attempt suicide? I think that this article makes it pretty clear that he was indeed murdered, completely inconsistent with a suicide, unless there was some reason that this right-handed man couldn't use his left hand, but I think it's highly improbable. And I think we can move on. The detective said a slug removed during an autopsy was of a large caliber, and he said that the revolver belonged to Snow and that the ballistics experts were trying to determine if it came from this gun. The gun had been fired twice. Now, about that, sometimes there can be a shot that is done out of nervousness. I mean, I don't even have the examples right in front of me, but just going off of memory from true crime programs over the years, sometimes a person can fire a warning shot. Even if someone's trying to commit suicide, they can just fire a shot to the ground. It's like a test shot almost. But in this particular case, if somebody's hands are shaking, then they can misfire on the first time, or maybe just in a giant fit of nervousness, or they have some type of drawback, and that's why one bullet grazed his scalp. I mean, hypothetically, if it were a suicide, but as I said, he was shot one in the left side of the head, and he's right-handed. I believe that this was a murder. On the way home in his car, there were 2 bags of food that he was taking home to his wife Bertie. Again, not consistent with the suicide. A bag of dog scraps and a large oil painting Snow had purchased late yesterday was in the back seat. Purely not consistent with a suicide. This seems like a murder. He was in fine spirits when I saw him last, said Mrs. Frances Clark, age 48, of 1852A Oakland Boulevard, Walnut Creek. She said that at 2 a.m. today she took the food to his car in the restaurant parking lot while he carried the painting as well as a checkered sports coat. So I don't really think that anything in that article truly suggests that this was a suicide. I mean, they're exploring the possibility, and the whole thing about the test shot or just being nervous. Yes, I can comprehend that, but I don't think that that's the case. It seems like for some reason this guy was murdered. Now, why? Why? Well, I have absolutely no idea. I mean, just going off that alone, I mean, did this guy have enemies? Did this guy have some type of trouble in his life that people didn't know about? Or was this somebody like an opportunistic serial killer, the way that Jeremy has proposed, that this person was murdered and that maybe it was done for a thrill kill, maybe it was done to impress somebody like Darlene Ferrin who would have been with him, or was this just someone in the wrong place at the wrong time? I mean, we explore this still also in the true crime world about these crimes that happen on the side of the road. Maybe someone makes an awkward facial expression at somebody, maybe somebody says one word to someone and it bothers them, so they murder them. I mean, that is also not unheard of. The next article that I would like to look at in regards to the murder of Thomas Snow comes from the San Francisco Examiner, September 28, 1965. Sheriff asks help in murder. So from September 24th to September 28th, it seems widely accepted that this is now a murder. Contra Costa County Sheriff Walter S. Young today asked the public to help him find 3 men who may know something about the murder of Thomas Snow, also known as Tommy, the popular Orinda restaurateur. Snow was found dying in his park station wagon on Taylor Boulevard near Walnut Creek early Friday by 2 California Highway patrolmen. He had been shot twice in the left side of the head, and he died an hour later in a Martinez hospital. Now, this article has a couple things different. Firstly, it says that he was shot twice on the side of the head, but the first article, which I believe to be more accurate, states that one bullet just grazed his scalp and it wasn't truly entering him. And the other one, I believe, stated that he was found outside the station wagon, but Young said the first person was a man between the ages of 19 and 20 years old, 5 feet 11 inches tall, with a blonde crew cut. Well, that certainly sounds like the Zodiac killer, except for the age. I think the Zodiac was older than that. He was seen in Snow's restaurant in the Casa Orinda about 9 p.m. on Thursday. The second man is described as being between 30 and 40 years old, 5 feet 11 inches tall, receding hairline, and wearing a large ornamental elk belt buckle, black wash pants, white t-shirt, and field boots. He was seen at about 1:30 a.m. Friday on Brookwood Drive in Orinda, near the restaurant. Now, this matches Richard Gaikowski a little bit more because Richard Gaikowski would have been 30 years old in 1965, and just going off of memory, if something stands out in my memory that Gaik was between 5'10 and 5'11, but don't quote me on that. And the third man the sheriff wants to review was seen hitchhiking on Withers Avenue near Taylor Boulevard sometime after midnight Friday, but after midnight on Friday. He appeared to be in his late 20s or early 30s, and he was 5 feet 7 with a slight build and was wearing a corduroy suit. So the police have suspects in the murder of Thomas Snow. But as I understand, this crime remains unsolved to this day, and it also is just, an absolute tragedy. Rest in peace to Thomas Snow. Now, is there a possible Zodiac killer connection? A lot of people believe that the Zodiac killer was someone who committed a series of homicides prior to the Lake Herman Road murders. And whether it's thinking that the crimes began with the 1962 murder of Ray Davis, or thinking that the crimes began with the 1965 murder of Tom Snow, it appears that some people just think that the Zodiac seemed way too organized as a murderer with Lake Herman Road and Blue Rock Springs to have committed those crimes for his first homicides. And I mean, so many points are just coming to mind right now because if we look at how a serial killer operates, there very frequently is an escalation in deviant behavior. And if we only look at the crimes that have been attributed to the Zodiac killer, Lake Herman Road, Blue Rock Springs, Lake Berryessa, and the Stine murder, you do see an escalation in an attempt to make things thrilling for him. For example, at Lake Herman Road, the killer murders two people, and he doesn't say anything, he remains silent, he doesn't write a letter, no phone calls. After the Blue Rock Springs shooting, there's a phone call. Then there's the letter with 3 parts of the cryptogram, the 408 cipher. And then you get to the Lake Berryessa stabbing, where the person is wearing a costume, he's having an extended conversation with the victims, he writes a message on Brian Hartwell's car door, he makes a phone call, and taking credit for the crimes. Now, the Lake Berryessa stabbing doesn't appear directly in a letter. Instead, the killer said that he was the murderer of the kids in the North Bay area, or he attacked the kids in the North Bay area. The term just North Bay area is used. Very, very vague language associated with Lake Berryessa, which has driven some people to think that the Lake Berryessa stabbing was a copycat, and that it wasn't even the same person who committed the other murders. And then, but let's say hypothetically it was. Let's say hypothetically Lake Berryessa was indeed the Zodiac killer, and it was the same killer. So then, the killer murders Paul Stine, a taxi driver in San Francisco in Presidio Heights, and he is walking away from the crime scene. And more or less, he is now just trying to do something where he knows almost certainly there are going to be witnesses. He knows almost certainly that people are going to see him, and that just elevates the thrill kill. It's doing something that is even more intense. Now, as far as the escalation in behavior, there was a comment that was left on a previous Zodiac killer news report where somebody said that he thought that the Lake Berryessa stabbing happened purely because of acting out a fantasy, purely because of trying to look badass or trying to just wear some type of hooded costume with the Zodiac killer symbol on it and the clip-on sunglasses, because it had meaning to him. He just wanted to turn himself into some type of comic book villain or just some type of real life character brought to life. And it was all about meaning to the killer, and it has no real relevance on the victims at all. And I mean, I think that that's a very reasonable conclusion. And a lot of people come to that conclusion on their own. They think that the the victims may not have been specifically targeted at Lake Berryessa, that this person wanted to commit a murder and he wanted to wear a hooded costume because he's escalating the thrill killing. He's trying to make it more intense and exciting for him, exciting in the disgusting way. And I think that there's a certain amount of credibility to that. Now let's go from Lake Berryessa back to the Stine murder, the Zodiac killer's final confirmed crime. Earlier this year, in the springtime, I was talking to you guys about some of the events that could have taken place after the Stine murder, after the Zodiac killer's final crime. And I said that one of the benefits of weighing the merit of the ideas is you can look at where are people making strong points and where are people making points that you want to challenge or that you want to disagree with. And recently on the channel, I was talking to you guys about the murder of Eric Selms. He was one of the people who was on the trail of the Zodiac, although he didn't know it at the time. You'll often hear stories of Eric Selms and Donald Falk working together. And really, the testimony of Donald Falk becomes very critical because Falk is one of the people who went on to live and say that he saw the Zodiac Killer. Now, it's possible that Eric Zelms also saw the Zodiac Killer that night, but he was killed in the line of duty. Eric Zelms was murdered on January 1st of 1970. His murder was the first crime that his murder was the first homicide in the Bay Area for the year of 1970. And I was talking to you guys about the Zodiac Killer's walking path from the taxi cab at Presidio Heights and where he would have gone and how he would have moved about, and looking at some different stories. Also, I once had a discussion with Mike Morford of ZodiacKiller.net when he was talking about how he challenged Donald Falk's credibility, because Donald Falk didn't come forward immediately with the information about how he saw somebody after the Stine murder. And the reason why this person wasn't stopped and arrested was there was the famous story of an all points bulletin going out to be on the lookout for an NMA, which was a Negro male adult, or as we would have said, black male, perhaps in more contemporary police lingo, that they should have been on the lookout for a black male instead of a white male, and that's why this person's able to walk by them. Now, for the longest time, I thought that the story with Donald Falk talking to the Zodiac Killer was not true. I could have accepted that Falk saw this Caucasian male walking past him, but I didn't think that he talked to him because there's a memo that was even written by Donald Falk stating that he didn't talk to the person, that he saw him. But one of the things that was shared by Richard Grinnell of Zodiac, Ciphers.com, is that there is also a timeline that was put out in the 1989 Crime of the Century documentary, which talks about one thing that makes the timeline make sense is if the Zodiac Killer pointed Donald Falk in the wrong direction, and he would have had to have gone down and possibly doubled back or possibly gone through an archway that might have been modified in the contemporary times. And where am I going with all of this? What is this all about? What are the points? Okay, the Zodiac Killer commits the murder of Paul Stine. Next, the Zodiac is walking away. Then the Zodiac sees Donald Falk and sees Eric Zelms, talks to both of them, points them in the wrong direction, and they've committed an enormous blunder, although it was unbeknownst to them at the time. Then, Howard Davis interviewed Eric Zelms' widow, Diana, and she provides the statement that, oh yeah, her version of the events is Eric Zelms and Donald Falk both talked to the Zodiac. The reason why Falk misrepresented his statement was actually to protect the reputation of Eric Zelms, who was a rookie cop, and he spent 340 days on the force, I believe it was, or was it 340, or less than 350 days on the force before he was murdered on January 1st of 1970. So he did it to protect Falk's reputation within the force. So that means that Mike Morford's statement could be correct, that Donald Falk doesn't have the best credibility when it comes to telling the truth, but he did indeed see the Zodiac Killer. And also that the Zodiac could have pointed them in the wrong direction, and all of that seems to be working out. But I do have to give credit to Dennis D., who is someone who had made lots of comments about the Zodiac's walking path after the Stine murder, and the Zodiac Killer said that he entered a nearby park, and they would have caught him if they searched the park. But one thing that Dennis D. pointed out was that the Zodiac Killer could have walked away from the taxicab, made a left turn, and been hiding in the little alcoves in Presidio Heights because he would have. It's another strong possibility about how the Zodiac was able to get away, that he was just able to hide and wait it out and then was able to escape unnoticed. But that would have meant that Armin Pellicetti could have walked past him, maybe not once but twice, or that maybe multiple members of law enforcement could have gone past the Zodiac while he had been hiding in the alcoves of the buildings in Presidio Heights. I suppose that's possible, and remember, in an unsolved crime, anything is possible. Now, I'd like to follow up with one final thing about the interview with Jeremy Berthiaume, author of So I See You Don't Paint Houses, and that relates not to the Zodiac case, but two of the unconfirmed Zodiac incidents. Okay, it is the Zodiac case, but the unconfirmed incidents of the attempted abduction of Kathleen Johns and the disappearance of Donna Lass from 1970. Both of these crimes occurred in 1970 on March 22nd and September 6th, respectively. And Jeremy also had somewhat of a unique theory in the sense that he believed that Richard Gaikowski was the Zodiac Killer. However, he stated that Lawrence Kane should be the prime suspect for the attempted abduction of Kathleen Johns and the murder of Donna Lass, although Donna Lass's remains have never been found. She is still listed as a missing person. And the reason why is, after the Kathleen Johns abduction, she is the person who was driving down Highway Route 132 and her wheel was wobbling, and then some guy saying, "Hey, your wheel is wobbling," and he's actually making up the story. The wheel was most likely fine, and then he says that he's trying to fix it, but he's actually loosening the bolts on her wheel. She tries to drive away, and then the wheel falls off, and he says, "Oh, well, I guess it's worse than I thought," and he's trying to give her a ride, and Kathleen Johns was pregnant, and she also had her other child with her. And she's in the car with this person for an extended period of time, and then she's able to escape. She's able to escape and then more or less run into what some people call a small ravine, but I don't really think that that's quite the best description. She's able to hide in the well, in the surroundings after she gets away from this person, jumps out of the car, runs out of the car, and Jeremy believes that she is a truth teller, that she is not making up the story. However, this person then returned to Kathleen Johns' car and put the wheel back on and then set the car on fire. Now, why would Lawrence Kane be a suspect in this crime? Jeremy's theory was that after the attempted abduction of Kathleen Johns, that the that she went to the police station and she saw a wanted poster for the Zodiac killer with the composite sketches that were done of the Zodiac from Presidio Heights, and she said, "That's the man that tried to abduct me." The Zodiac killer would then take credit for the crime later on in the it's about 2.5 months after the event took place, and don't quote me on the date on that, but yeah, but the Zodiac waited a substantial amount of time and then took credit for it. Then Lawrence Kane, if he did actually commit the attempted abduction of Kathleen Johns, thought, "Oh my goodness, I seem to look like this Zodiac killer guy. I can pass for the Zodiac. I can commit a crime and get away with it and blame it on the Zodiac." And then Lawrence Kane committed the attempted abduction of Donna Lass on September 6 of 1970. Donna Lass worked at the Sahara Tahoe Hotel and Casino, and Lawrence Kane also worked for the Sahara Tahoe Hotel and Casino, and both Jeremy and I were discussing this in the interview. We're like, well, when? We don't know. When I talked to Travis Miller, who ran the Lawrence Kane word press, he stated that Lawrence Kane's driver's license was containing the information that Lawrence Kane worked at the Sahara Tahoe in 1976. But, I mean, that's 6 years after the abduction of Donna Lass. Now, was he there and did he know Donna Lass in 1970? It's possible. It's possible. But in Jeremy's theory, he abducts Donna Lass, murders her, and then writes the Pines card, the Peek Through the Pines card, also called the, well, he writes a card that is connecting the Zodiac killer to Lake Tahoe, and where the Sahara Tahoe Hotel and Casino was. It's since been renamed the Hard Rock Hotel. So that would have been a way that he could have committed the crime, the murder of Donna Lass, blame it on the Zodiac killer, and never get caught. And before you think that that's an absolutely ridiculous theory, well, the Zodiac killer has never been caught. The murderer of Donna Lass has never been caught. Or I should say the abductor of Donna Lass has never been caught. The person who abducted Kathleen Johns has never been caught. Is it just so possible that that plan worked? That would explain why Lawrence Kane gets pulled into this mix, even though, I mean, Classic Chevy Cat was the one who pointed this out in the comments section, that Lawrence Kane only seems to have a real connection to the Kathleen Johns incident and the disappearance of Donna Lass, for the reasons stated, that he was, well, I should share some additional information. Kathleen Johns also stated that Lawrence Kane was the person who abducted her. She identified him out of a photo lineup, although it was years later, it was decades later. And, I mean, I'm going to give my honest take on the subject. Jeremy and I had somewhat of a disagreement in the sense that Lawrence Kane matches the physical descriptions of the Zodiac killer. I think that Lawrence Kane looks quite different than the Zodiac. I mean, I think that he has a very different nose shape. I think that he has much darker hair than what was described at Presidio Heights. I also think that he seems to just have somewhat of a wider face and more of a square-shaped face than the composite sketches from Presidio Heights as well. When I first saw the photos of Lawrence Kane, I thought he looked absolutely nothing like the Zodiac Killer. Then I read some descriptions about his behavior, and he did seem to have a lot of consistent things with being a serial killer, like the early life of deviant behavior, getting busted for shoplifting and being like a peeping tom, I think it was. It's been a while since I did the episode Lawrence Kane Criminal History on this channel, another old-fashioned black box recording, but he was definitely had these small arrests that took place throughout his early life, and he goes on to actually have somewhat of a career in real estate, though. But a lot of serial killers have a career and then they commit murders behind the scenes. No matter what, though, I think one of the more interesting theories that Jeremy put forward was related to not only Geik, but also that Lawrence Kane was a real serial killer. He just got away with it. And I mean, I think that's one of the most fascinating elements of his theory, that both Richard Gaikowski and Lawrence Kane were real serial killers, and they got away with it. And I think that the claims about Lawrence Kane are definitely easier to follow because, I mean, Lawrence Kane is the prime suspect in the 1974 murder of Dana Lull, who was abducted in Nevada, and her body was found 2 weeks after the abduction in a mine shaft. And something very similar could have happened to Donna Lassett. She was abducted and her body was disposed of in an unknown location. I mean, I definitely don't think that those things are beyond belief. But right now, I would like to get to your supporter shoutouts on BuyMeACoffee.com. One more time, anybody who makes a donation or contribution to help support the show will get a shout out on Zodiac Monday. And our first one comes to us from Batman66. Was actually left through the super thanks on YouTube, Batman66. I thank you for your regular and consistent support. And the next one comes to us from Michael Midnight Ventures, who says, "Hey Ned, Michael here from Midnight Ventures on YouTube. Enjoy your drink." And Midnight Ventures is a longtime follower of Black Box Online Radio, even listening back into the days of the Black Box before there was any type of logo on the screen and there were just snowflakes in the background. Gotta give people something to focus on, even though I did start the channel with purely a black box on the screen. And our next comment comes to us from Stuart McAdam, and I was a guest on Stuart McAdam's channel. He runs a YouTube channel that talks a lot about things like internet marketing or the creation of running a page online or trying to create an internet following. Lots of good content over on Stuart McAdam's channel. And I was just talking about the story of Black Box Online Radio. And Stuart McAdam not only contributed on BuyMeACoffee.com, he also got in touch with a designer who helped make the thumbnail for this episode, as well as 3 other possibilities which might appear in some other Black Box Online Radio Zodiac Mondays. But Stuart McAdam writes in his comment, "For a well-deserved coffee after a great chat, Ned. Thank you so much for switching roles and becoming the expert." Well, I mean, I am hardly an expert on running a YouTube channel or even on the Zodiac Killer mystery. I'm just talking about some things that I find to be fascinating, but always trying my best to be accurate. And then the next comment comes to us from Floyd Black 53, who says, "Ned, this interview with Jeremy, I hope that is correct, is fantastic." And yes, that was Jeremy Berthiaume, author of So I See You Don't Paint Houses. Great work. Thank you so much for all that you do. All right, and I appreciate all of you guys on BuyMeACoffee.com and the super thanks on YouTube. You guys are all awesome, and it does really help the show. And in the near future, as I've mentioned before, I will be launching the Black Box Online Radio membership, which will be $10 a month, very similar to a $10 a month club. And there's going to be all types of bonus features. You'll also get access to an original publication that I wrote called True Crime Teaches Us to Conquer Toxic People. And there are going to be other benefits that you can see on the buymeacoffee.com membership page. One more time, buymeacoffee.com/blackboxned88. And right now I would like to talk about some things that were shared on Stuart McAdam's YouTube channel, because I was a guest on there to talk about the foundation of Black Box Online Radio, and some points that didn't get mentioned in the interview that was uploaded were that I started this channel with just a black box on the screen, and I was just using it as my daily YouTube segment. And I tried a lot of different ways of recording the episodes. For a while, I just used a type of live streaming format on BBOR, and again, there's just a black box on the screen, but while I was live streaming, the audio quality did not come out very well, and I just left those things up there, and a lot of people complained about it in the comments section. And looking back 3 years later, or 4 years later now, actually, yeah, this channel's been running for 6 years. Looking back, I was just thinking, what on earth was I doing putting out a show with no images and audio that people can't even really listen to? And what I was reminded of was I was watching a video where someone was talking about the book Zen and the Art of Archery, and it says that in that book that talks about how some people focus on the process, some people focus on the result, and what you need to do is to focus both on the process and on the result. And that's it. That's it. I was only focusing on the process when it came to the creation of these episodes. It was just adding something to my day. It was just creating my own daily YouTube segment. And I'm just thinking about what I'm going to say. I'm just thinking about the ideas. But what about the finished product? What about the result? And then there's just, a black box on the screen with audio that isn't functioning too well. And another reason why I chose to create Black Box Online Radio in its exact format was, I think it was 2008. I just found this YouTube video where these guys were just telling really dirty jokes. And there was a black box on the screen. It was the first time I ever found a YouTube video with just a black box on the screen. And I guess they didn't want their faces revealed, because they're talking about a lot of profane and obscene things. Sure, I get it, but I still had to laugh at it. Make no mistake, I have a very open sense of humor. But I think that that was an example where the content was marketing itself. And over the years, I found that other channels also just would have a black box on the screen. I've listened to numerous episodes from Howard Stern, and little clips like 10 minutes, 20 minutes from Howard Stern where there's just a black box on the screen that was uploaded by one of the fans. But what I didn't account for was Howard Stern is someone who already has a following. He already is famous, and people are going to listen to his material in any type of format. And not to mention that Howard Stern is famous for being a radio host. And people are expecting to hear the audio rather than just seeing a bunch of images moving around. And YouTube really is a different world because, I download podcasts all the time. Especially in 2019, 2020, I was almost like, well, not addicted to them, but I listened to them very, very frequently. And I had this job where I could listen to audio. It's actually when I was the Evening Watchman, which became the source material for my book, Killer on a White Horse, A Story of the Evening Watchman. I was allowed to listen to audio at work, so I would just download podcasts, and those have no visuals, those have no images, but YouTube is just a different world. And here is something else that has truly changed from 2017 to 2023. YouTube has truly expanded into a world of studio-generated content where it's not completely like documentaries that you would see on the History Channel. Yes, you can watch those on YouTube, but original YouTube content has professional equipment, it has professional sound mixing, it has all types of things that are specifically designed to get your attention, and it's meant to be created in a YouTube-based format. So the YouTube game has truly, truly evolved to a point where it used to be just in the past, people would be talking into their camera for up to 10 minutes. Like, do you guys remember that back in 2006? If you wanted to upload videos, you had to be a director. You had to be a real director. And there was a maximum of 10 minutes that you could upload. And I used YouTube all the time just for listening to musicians. Like a lot of people in their teen years, I was 18 years old at the time in 2006. So I was just really into music. And I just liked watching YouTube musicians, I guess we'd call them, just play the guitar in their bedroom. Or maybe if they have a little bit of editing, then, it shows them playing their guitar with a type of background and so on. I loved that stuff, but what happened was everybody started calling themselves a director, so then YouTube just took off the time limit, and the only real requirement for me in the past was I had to register the channels with a phone number, and then I was able to upload content longer than 15 minutes. But for a very long time, the Black Box Online Radio episodes were 14 minutes for that reason. Again, I was focusing on the process. And sometimes being an adaptable person does not work out in the world of media or in the business world because, I mean, you just want to always adapt to the situation. I'm like, well, I need to verify my YouTube account to put out content longer than 15 minutes. Why don't I just make content that's 14 minutes long? And when you're doing that as a black box podcast, where there is just a black box on the screen, you're really not offering the listeners very much. It's just 14 minutes with no images from somebody whom they had never heard of before, and for about 3.5 years I was anonymous on YouTube. I mean, I just didn't even share my name because I wanted it to be spooky and mysterious. But I'm so glad that I went through the verification process so I could put out longer content like what I was talking about with Jeremy Bertiome. And I truly agree with Joe Rogan when he said that a big difference between YouTube and podcasts compared to conventional forms of media like TV and radio is the time limits. You do not have to cut down on your time limits in your discussions. I mean, like, you don't have to cut down on the discussion to make allowances for the time. You can just talk in an open-ended way. You can give the guests as much talking time as they wanted, and that's exactly what Jeremy and I did. We ended up with 3 hours and 42 minutes thereabouts, and I really found that talking to somebody face to face, like we did it as an in-person interview, and it allowed the discussions to keep on going because I'm also the host of the Zodiac Killer Channel's Interview with the Experts series, and I mean, I talk to all kinds of Zodiac experts, and we both follow the mystery and we both want answers. However, I think that even talking like via webcam just has a little bit less of an interactive element. Whereas when you're face to face with somebody, you can just keep going and going and going, the way that Joe Rogan did with a lot of his interviews. And he also was very clear that he wanted to give the guest as much time as they wanted. And some people out there even do more than that. I mean, some of these live streamers will do 8, 9, 10 hour live streams when they're just interacting with the guests and interacting with people who are in the chat and reading off comments from other chats. So those are some points that I wanted to share about creating a YouTube channel, and those old black box recordings are still up there, and mostly the ones that were recorded, pre-recorded and uploaded, I don't mind keeping those up there, even though they are a little bit discombobulated with the ranting, and they are very separated out in terms of the ideas, and sometimes I'm just kind of like talking in circles a little bit too much. But I mean, that's one of the real benefits to running a podcast. You can ramble on, you can talk about things, you can explore different ideas, and you don't have to worry about you know about where the direction is going, as long as you tie it all together in the end. But ultimately, the episodes that I did in the live stream format that have the terrible audio, they are still there, and I just didn't bother to take them down, but perhaps I should, because I think that they are somewhat unsatisfactory, and I'm at the point now where I don't only want to focus on the process, I also want to focus on the result, and I mean, I want to do things that you guys want to respond to, and that is one thing that I do think really sets Black Box Online Radio apart from a lot of the other programs out there is, I mean, I really want to create this balance between just content that I want to put out and content that you guys want to hear. And I mean, I really listen to what you guys say in the comments section. You want to hear more about Jack the Ripper? I want to hear more about Jack the Ripper, and I'm just pulled into that world now. And so many people have covered the Ripper mystery. Have talked about so many different theorists and ideas, and looking at all of these examples that have been put forward as not only the Ripper suspects, but also the theories involving the um, the connections among the suspects and the victims. And that's why there's going to be the Jack the Ripper report. And one reason for that is I used to do the Wednesday AMA, right? Where I was doing the Ask Me Anything, where I would respond to your questions and comments. And there'd be a lot of Zodiac Killer content. I would also do a weekly question about narcissism because I would get this. I was on an email chain that would have that. And I thought that those episodes were so much better, or I felt so much better about them because I'm talking about many different ideas within a single episode, and it's very general as opposed to microanalyzing the details and the facts. Now, some people are good at microanalyzing details and the facts, and that is so valuable. But for me, I'm just a little bit more general in terms of my approach to the subjects. So I think that a Jack the Ripper report would be very strong because I can talk about different crimes, different suspects, different writers, different theories, and it can be all contained within a single episode. So please feel free to tune in this Wednesday for the first Jack the Ripper report. And if you're listening to this episode in the future, I mean, there's going to be a new playlist of Jack the Ripper reports. There's also a playlist of Zodiac Killer news reports, Zodiac Monday episodes. And for now, I would just like to say thank you so much to everyone who has listened to this episode, and I will see you guys over on Instagram, and I'm going to be releasing some new short episodes in the near future that are going to be available on Instagram and on Facebook Reels, and of course the YouTube Shorts page. And anybody can write the show at BlackBoxOnlineRadio at AOL.com. That's all for me now. Goodbye.